In the vast expanse of the cosmos, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against an infinite shore, there exists a truth that even the most advanced species struggle to comprehend: humanity's capacity for both devastating vengeance and profound forgiveness. When the Zephyrian Empire made the gravest mistake in their 1,000-year history, taking the life of an innocent human child, they unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would reshape the very foundation of galactic diplomacy. What happens when a species known throughout the galaxy for their clinical precision and emotional detachment suddenly finds themselves drowning in an alien concept called guilt? What unfolds when beings who have never known remorse must learn the human art of seeking forgiveness from a species they've underestimated for centuries? This is not just a story of loss and redemption. This is the tale of how one tragic moment became the catalyst for the greatest transformation in interstellar relations the galaxy has ever witnessed. It's about the moment when the hunters became the hunted, when the mighty fell to their knees, and when humanity showed the universe what it truly means to be human. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, mercy, and the incredible power of the human spirit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields of Terra Nova, humanity's third agricultural colony in the Kepler system. 7-year-old Emma Chen skipped between the golden stalks, her laughter echoing across the peaceful farmland like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Her small hands clutched a collection of wildflowers she'd gathered for her mother, each bloom carefully selected with the serious consideration only a child could possess. Emma had no knowledge of the political tensions brewing in the Outer Rim territories, no understanding of the Zephyrian Empire's growing concern about human expansion into what they considered their ancestral hunting grounds. To her, the universe was as simple as sunshine, flowers, and the promise of fresh-baked cookies waiting at home. High above the colony, invisible to the naked eye, the Zephyrian scout ship, Void's Edge, maintained a silent vigil. Commander Kethvar, a seasoned warrior whose silver carapace bore the scars of 100 battles, observed the human settlement through his ship's advanced sensors. His compound eyes, each capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation across dozens of spectrums, scanned the peaceful scene with the cold efficiency of a predator. The humans show no signs of military fortification, reported Sub-Commander Nixtal, her forearms dancing across the control interface with mechanical precision. Population appears to be primarily agricultural workers and their offspring. No significant defensive capabilities detected. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what humans might have interpreted as satisfaction, but which among Zephyrians indicated careful consideration. The Empire had spent months debating the human question. These strange bipedal mammals had appeared in the galaxy seemingly from nowhere, spreading across star systems with an alarming rate that defied conventional understanding of species expansion. Unlike other spacefaring civilizations that took millennia to establish themselves, humans had colonized dozens of worlds in mere decades. Their rapid expansion continues to concern the High Council, Kethvar mused, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that marked him as nobility among his species. Intelligence suggests they possess reproduction rates that exceed galactic norms by significant margins. The Zephyrians had ruled their corner of the galaxy for over 1,000 years through careful calculation and decisive action. They were a species that valued precision above all else, viewing the universe as a vast machine where every component had its designated function. Chaos, unpredictability, and rapid change were concepts that fundamentally challenged their worldview. Humans represented everything the Zephyrians found disturbing about the newer species emerging in their sector. Where Zephyrians planned expansion campaigns across centuries, humans seemed to colonize worlds on impulses. Where Zephyrians carefully controlled population growth through genetic protocols, humans reproduced with what appeared to be reckless abandon. Most troubling of all, humans displayed an emotional volatility that made them completely unpredictable in diplomatic and military scenarios. "Commander!" Nixtal's voice carried a note of urgency that immediately drew Kethvar's attention. "I'm detecting an energy signature that doesn't match our intelligence reports." Kethvar moved to the primary sensor station, his tall frame casting shadows across the dimly lit bridge. The Zephyrian Command Center was a study in functional design, every surface serving a specific purpose, every light calibrated to optimal wavelengths for their visual spectrum. "Elaborate." "There appears to be some form of experimental technology in the settlement. The energy readings are unusual. They don't match any known human technological signatures in our database." This was precisely the kind of development that justified the Empire's concerns about human expansion. Their intelligence networks had reported similar anomalies on other human colonies, suggesting these mammals were developing technologies at rates that exceeded their apparent level of civilization. Such rapid technological advancement without corresponding cultural evolution was considered a significant threat to galactic stability. "Orders from High Command are clear," Kethvar stated, though something in his voice suggested reluctance. "Any human colony showing signs of advanced technological development beyond established parameters must be investigated and neutralized if necessary." The phrase, "neutralized if necessary," had very specific meanings within Zephyrian military doctrine. It represented a sliding scale of responses, from technological suppression to complete elimination of threats. The decision of which response to implement fell to field commanders based on their assessment of the situation. Nixtal's four arms paused their constant motion across the control surfaces. Among Zephyrians, this stillness indicated deep concern. "Commander, the energy signature appears to be emanating from the residential area. Civilian population density is high in that sector." Through the ship's sensors, they could observe the daily life of the colony unfolding below. Human adults moved between buildings with purpose, some tending to crops, others maintaining equipment, all displaying the industrious behavior that characterized their species. Human children ran between the buildings, their high-pitched vocalizations carrying across the settlement in patterns that Zephyrian linguists had identified as play behavior. In the wheat fields, Emma Chen had discovered a butterfly caught in a spider's web. With the gentle care that defined childhood innocence, she carefully freed the creature, watching with delight as it fluttered away on orange and black wings. She had no concept that her actions were being observed from orbit, no understanding that beings were debating her fate in languages her species had never heard. "Begin deep scan protocol," Kethvar ordered, though his mandibles showed signs of reluctance. "We need to identify the source of the anomalous readings." The Void's edge descended through Terra Nova's atmosphere, its stealth systems rendering it invisible to human detection methods. As they approached the settlement, their sensors began painting a detailed picture of the colony's layout, technology levels, and population distribution. What they discovered challenged every assumption in their intelligence reports. The energy signature wasn't coming from advanced weapons or mysterious technology. Instead, their sensors detected something far more mundane, yet somehow more disturbing to the Zephyrian worldview. The human colony had developed a fusion power system that operated at efficiency levels their own engineers considered theoretically impossible. More concerning, the humans had achieved this advancement not through careful scientific progression, but through what appeared to be intuitive engineering and trial-and-error experimentation. "This doesn't conform to established technological development patterns," Nixtal reported, her voice carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated confusion. "According to our models, a civilization requires a minimum of 2 centuries to develop this level of fusion technology. These humans have been on this world for less than 5 years." Kethvar studied the sensor data with growing unease. Throughout the galaxy, technological advancement followed predictable patterns. Species developed tools, then basic electronics, then advanced computing, then energy systems, each step requiring specific time periods and cultural evolution. Humans seemed to skip entire developmental phases, creating technologies through methods that defied rational explanation. "There's something else, Commander," Nixtal continued. "The fusion reactor appears to be unstable. Not dangerous, but inefficient. It's as if they've discovered advanced principles but lack the theoretical framework to optimize their implementation." This observation provided a small measure of relief to Kethvar. If humans were developing advanced technologies without understanding the underlying principles, they might pose less of a long-term threat than initially assessed. However, High Command's orders remain clear: investigate and neutralize if necessary. The ship settled into a hover pattern above the settlement, its sensors conducting detailed scans of every building, every piece of equipment, every human within the colony boundaries. The scanning process required nearly an hour of careful observation, during which the crew documented human behavior patterns, social structures, and technological capabilities. Emma Chen continued her exploration of the wheat fields, oblivious to the mechanical eyes observing her every movement. She had found a small grove of apple trees at the field's edge, and was attempting to climb one to reach fruit growing on the higher branches. Her determination was evident as she tried repeatedly to reach the lowest branch, each failure followed by renewed effort with no sign of discouragement.
"Curious," Kethvar murmured, watching the child's persistence.
"The juvenile shows remarkable determination despite repeated failure. This behavior pattern appears consistent across the human population. Zephyrian children were trained from hatching to accept limitations, and work within established parameters. The sight of a young being repeatedly attempting something beyond its physical capabilities would have been considered problematic behavior, requiring immediate correction. Yet this human child continued her efforts with what appeared to be joy rather than frustration. "Commander, I've completed the technology assessment," Nixtal reported. "The fusion reactor represents a significant advancement beyond expected parameters, but the humans lack the theoretical knowledge to weaponize the technology effectively. Threat level assessment: moderate technological concern, minimal immediate military risk." Under normal circumstances, this assessment would have resulted in a recommendation for continued monitoring rather than direct intervention. However, High Command had been increasingly concerned about human expansion rates and their unpredictable technological leaps. The standing orders were explicit: any human colony showing advanced technological development was to be addressed decisively to prevent potential future threats. "Prepare the neutralization beam," Kethvar ordered, though his voice carried undertones of reluctance that surprised even him. "Target the fusion reactor. Complete destruction will send the appropriate message while minimizing civilian casualties." The neutralization beam was a precise weapon designed to destroy specific targets without causing widespread collateral damage. By eliminating the fusion reactor, they would cripple the colony's advanced technology while leaving the population alive to spread word of Zephyrian power. It was considered a measured response that balanced threat elimination with diplomatic considerations. As the weapon systems powered up, Emma Chen finally succeeded in reaching the apple tree's lowest branch. Her triumphant laugh echoed across the wheat fields as she pulled herself up toward the fruit hanging just within reach. For a moment she sat on the branch, surveying her domain with the satisfaction of conquest that only children could truly appreciate. The neutralization beam fired with surgical precision, its energy lance reaching down from orbit to strike the fusion reactor complex with devastating accuracy. The explosion that followed was contained and controlled, destroying the target without creating a massive crater or radiation hazard. By Zephyrian standards, it was a textbook example of precision warfare. But the shockwave, though carefully calculated to remain within acceptable parameters, proved stronger than anticipated when interacting with Terra Nova's specific atmospheric conditions. The wavefront propagated across the settlement faster than predicted, its energy dispersing through the ground in patterns that their models had failed to account for. In the apple tree, Emma Chen felt the ground shake beneath her. The tremor was gentle at first, like a giant taking a deep breath. But then it grew stronger. The branch she was sitting on began to sway, and she gripped it tightly, her laughter turning to concern as the shaking continued. The ancient apple tree, its roots weakened by decades of growth in Terra Nova's rich but unstable soil, began to lean as the shockwave disturbed its foundation. Emma, sensing danger with the instinctive awareness that had kept human children alive for millennia, tried to climb down toward the trunk. But the tree was falling faster than her small hands could carry her to safety. Aboard the Void's edge, Kethvar watched in horror as the unthinkable unfolded. The neutralization beam had functioned exactly as designed, destroying its intended target with minimal collateral damage. But the secondary effects, the tiny variables that no model could account for, had created a tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. The apple tree crashed to the ground with Emma Chen still among its branches. The impact was cushioned by the soft earth and the tree's own foliage. But the child's small body was not designed to withstand such forces. She lay still among the fallen leaves, her collection of wildflowers scattered around her like a natural memorial. "Commander!" Nixtal's voice carried harmonic frequencies that indicated severe distress. "We have an unintended casualty. Human juvenile. Approximately 7 years of their standard cycles. Vital signs are negative." The bridge of the Void's edge fell into absolute silence. In 1,000 years of military operations, Zephyrian forces had prided themselves on precision and control. They were surgical in their interventions, clinical in their calculations, and had built their reputation on the ability to achieve objectives without unintended consequences. Emma Chen's death represented something unprecedented in Zephyrian experience. Not just a mistake, but a mistake that involved the death of a completely innocent being. A child who had been playing in a field, climbing a tree, pursuing the simple joys that define childhood across every species in the galaxy. Kethvar stood frozen at his command station, his compound eyes unable to look away from the sensor display showing the motionless human child. In his centuries of military service, he had witnessed the deaths of countless beings. Warriors, politicians, criminals, terrorists, all beings whose deaths could be rationalized within the context of military necessity or justice. But this was different. This was a child who had died not because of any threat she posed, not because of any action she had taken, but because of variables and calculations and unforeseen consequences that had transformed a precise military operation into something monstrous. "Commander," Nixtal spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Human adults are responding to the casualty. They appear to be distressed." Through their senses, they could see Emma's parents running across the wheat field, their movements displaying the frantic energy that characterized human emergency response. Emma's mother reached her first, her anguished cries carrying across the settlement as she gathered her daughter's broken body into her arms. The sound that emerged from the human female was unlike anything in Zephyrian experience. It was raw, primal, and carried emotional frequencies that seemed to bypass rational thought and strike directly at something deeper. Even through the ship's sensors and communication systems, the sound affected the Zephyrian crew in ways they couldn't understand or explain. "I have never heard such vocalizations," Nixtal reported, her forearms trembling as they struggled to maintain contact with the control surfaces. "The emotional intensity appears to exceed normal parameters for grief response." Kethvar wanted to order an immediate departure, to leave Terra Nova behind, and file a report that would classify the incident as an acceptable margin of error within military operations. But something kept him rooted to his position, watching as more humans gathered around the fallen child, their faces displaying expressions of anguish that spoke to universal themes of loss and sorrow. "Sir, we should withdraw," Nixtal suggested. "The mission objective has been accomplished. The advanced technology has been neutralized." But Kethvar couldn't move, couldn't give the orders that would take them away from this place. For the first time in his military career, he was experiencing something that Zephyrians had no adequate terminology for, no cultural framework to process or understand. He was experiencing guilt. Among the humans below, Emma's father had arrived, his face a mask of devastation as he knelt beside his wife and daughter. The man's hands shook as he checked for signs of life. Hope and despair warring across his features in expressions that needed no translation across species barriers. Other colonists were gathering, their voices creating a chorus of concern and grief that rose from the settlement like smoke from a funeral pyre. Children were ushered away from the scene, but their questions carried clearly. What happened to Emma? Why won't she wake up? When will she play with us again? The innocence of those questions struck Kethvar like physical blows. These human juveniles didn't understand death, didn't comprehend that their playmate would never run through the wheat fields again, would never climb another tree, would never laugh at the simple joy of freeing a butterfly from a spider's web. "Commander," Nixtal's voice carried urgent undertones, "I'm detecting increased human communication activity. They appear to be transmitting distress signals to other human colonies." This was expected behavior. Humans were known for their strong social bonds and rapid communication networks. Word of the incident would spread throughout their colonial network within hours, potentially reaching Earth itself within days. The Zephyrian Empire had planned for this, prepared diplomatic responses that would frame the incident as an unfortunate but necessary intervention against technological threats. But watching Emma Chen's parents cradle their daughter's broken body, those prepared responses felt hollow and inadequate. How could any diplomatic language, any political justification, address the raw reality of this moment? How could the Empire's 1,000-year tradition of calculated responses account for the sight of beings destroyed not by malice, but by the simple failure to consider every variable? "Sir, incoming transmission from the colony," Nixtar reported. "The humans are attempting to establish communication with something. Their signals are broadcasting on multiple frequencies, but they don't appear to be directed at any known recipients." Kethvar realized with growing unease that the humans were transmitting blindly into space, calling out to anyone who might be listening, seeking answers about the destruction that had befallen their colony. They didn't know who had attacked them or why, but they were reaching out with the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might provide explanations or assistance. "Are they requesting help?" Kethvar asked, though he wasn't certain why the answer mattered. "Negative, Commander. The transmissions appear to be questions. They're asking who did this, why their fusion reactor was destroyed, whether anyone can explain what happened to cause the ground tremors that led to the tree collapse. The humans didn't even understand that they had been attacked. To them, the destruction of their reactor and the death of their child appeared to be separate, tragic events without clear connection. They were seeking understanding, not vengeance, trying to comprehend rather than retaliate. This realization hit Kethvar with unexpected force. In Zephyrian culture, an attack would be immediately recognized, analyzed, and answered with proportional response. But these humans were simply trying to understand what had happened to their community, what had taken their child from them. whether there was anything they could have done to prevent the tragedy. "Commander, what are your orders?" Nixtal asked, though her voice suggested she was as confused by the situation as he was. Kethvar looked at the sensor display one final time, watching as Emma's parents slowly carried her body toward the settlement, their movements careful and reverent, as if she were merely sleeping and might wake if disturbed. The other humans followed in a procession that spoke to the universal nature of grief, their heads bowed in respect for a young life ended too soon. "Return to base," he finally ordered, though the words felt like stones in his throat. "File a standard mission completion report." Technological threat neutralized, minimal collateral damage within acceptable parameters. As the Void's Edge climbed away from Terra Nova's atmosphere, Kethvar stood alone on the bridge, staring at the stars ahead, while his mind remained fixed on the image of a human child lying still among scattered wildflowers. For the first time in his centuries of military service, he questioned whether following orders and achieving objectives was enough to justify the consequences of action. Behind them, on the surface of Terra Nova, Emma Chen's parents began the heartbreaking process of saying goodbye to their daughter. They would never know that her death had been caused by beings watching from orbit, would never understand that she had died because of calculations and variables and political concerns that existed light years beyond her small world of wheat fields and apple trees, but her death would not be forgotten. In ways that neither Kethvar nor the Zephyrian Empire could anticipate, Emma Chen's death would become the catalyst for events that would reshape the relationship between their species forever. The guilt that was growing in Kethvar's mind would spread like ripples across the galaxy, carrying consequences that no amount of political calculation could predict or control. The universe had just become a more complicated place, and the Zephyrians were about to learn that some actions carry weights far beyond their intended scope. The funeral was held 3 days after Emma Chen's death, beneath the same sky that had witnessed her final moments of joy. The human settlement had transformed itself into something that defied Zephyrian understanding of grief protocols. Instead of the efficient disposal of deceased biomass that characterized most galactic civilizations, the humans had created an elaborate ceremony that seemed to celebrate the deceased individual's existence while simultaneously acknowledging their permanent absence. Commander Kethvar watched from orbit, his ship's sensors recording every detail of the proceedings with the clinical precision that defined Zephyrian military doctrine. Yet the data flowing across his screen seemed inadequate to capture the essential nature of what was unfolding below. The humans had gathered in numbers that exceeded the colony's population, with representatives arriving from other settlements across the planet and even from nearby star systems. "I count over 3,000 individuals in attendance," reported Subcommander Nixtel, her forearms moving across sensor controls with mechanical efficiency, even as her voice carried undertones of confusion. "This exceeds population density of the primary settlement by significant margins. The economic cost of such gathering must be substantial." Kethvar studied the sensor readings, trying to understand the logic behind such massive resource expenditure for a single deceased individual. In Zephyrian society, death was acknowledged with efficient ceremony and immediate recycling of biological materials to serve the greater community. The deceased individual's contributions were recorded in historical databases, their genetic materials preserved for potential future use, and their physical remains processed through established protocols. But the humans had constructed something that appeared to be a permanent monument in the wheat field where Emma had fallen. The structure was simple by galactic engineering standards, yet it had been built with obvious care and attention to aesthetic rather than functional considerations. Flowers had been arranged around the monument in patterns that served no practical purpose but created visual displays of remarkable beauty. "The monument appears to serve no functional purpose," Nixtal observed, echoing Kethvar's thoughts. Construction materials could have been utilized for agricultural expansion or infrastructure improvement. Instead, they have created a structure that provides no economic or survival advantage. Through the ship's sensors, they could observe humans approaching the monument in small groups, their behavior displaying patterns that Zephyrian anthropologists had struggled to categorize. Some individuals placed additional flowers at the structure's base. Others stood silently for extended periods, their faces displaying expressions that suggested internal emotional processing. Children were lifted to touch the monument's surface, their small hands tracing engravings that appeared to spell out the deceased individual's name and biographical information. "The emotional investment appears disproportionate to the practical loss," Kethvar murmured, though something in his voice suggested uncertainty about his own assessment. "A single juvenile represents minimal impact on overall population or productivity metrics." But even as he spoke these words, Kefar found himself struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in Zephyrian understanding. The sight of Emma's parents, standing beside the monument with expressions of profound loss, created responses in his neural pathways that defied rational analysis. Their grief was not diminishing with time as psychological models predicted, but seemed to be intensifying into something that transcended individual emotional response. Commander, Nixtal's voice carried warning harmonics. I'm detecting unusual neural activity in your brain chemistry. Recommend medical evaluation upon return to base. Kefar was aware of the changes occurring in his thought patterns. Sleep cycles had become irregular, filled with recurring visual memories of the moment Emma Chen fell from the apple tree. Concentration during routine duties required conscious effort that had never been necessary before. Most disturbing, he found himself questioning operational decisions that he would have implemented without hesitation just days earlier. Medical evaluation will not be necessary, he stated, though his voice lacked conviction. Continue monitoring human behavioral patterns. High Command requires comprehensive analysis of their grief response protocols. The Zephyrian Empire's interest in human emotional responses was both academic and strategic. Understanding how different species processed loss and trauma provided valuable intelligence for diplomatic and military planning. But the data being collected from Terra Nova challenged every established model in their psychological databases. Human grief appeared to operate according to principles that defied logical analysis. Instead of diminishing over time, emotional responses were intensifying and spreading to individuals who had no direct relationship with the deceased. Humans from across the star system continued arriving at Terra Nova, their journey costs exceeding any rational economic calculation, yet they came bearing gifts and expressions of support for Emma's family. The deceased individual has become a focal point for colony-wide emotional response, Nixtal reported. Productivity levels have decreased by 37% as humans continue to gather at the monument site instead of performing essential duties. In Zephyrian society, such behavior would have been classified as psychological dysfunction requiring immediate intervention. Communities could not afford to sacrifice productivity for emotional indulgence, particularly in colonial environments where survival margins were often narrow. Yet the human settlement not only tolerated this apparent dysfunction, but seemed to be actively encouraging it. There's something else, Commander, Nixtal continued. The humans have begun broadcasting transmissions about the deceased individual. Not distress calls or requests for assistance, but what appear to be stories. Kefar moved to the communication station, studying the intercepted transmissions with growing bewilderment. The humans were indeed broadcasting stories about Emma Chen across multiple frequencies, sharing memories and anecdotes about her brief existence with anyone who might be listening. The transmissions contain no strategic information, no political content, no requests for assistance or cooperation. Instead, they were sharing details that seemed utterly insignificant. How Emma had named every butterfly in her collection. How she insisted on saying goodnight to the wheat plants before bedtime. How she had once spent an entire afternoon teaching a kitten to play fetch. These stories served no apparent purpose except to preserve and transmit memories of an individual who would never contribute to society again. Why would they waste communication resources on such trivial information? Nixtal asked, her forearms pausing their constant motion in a gesture that indicated deep confusion. Kefar had no answer. Zephyrian communication protocols focused on efficiency and purpose, transmitting only information that served specific functional goals. The concept of broadcasting memories for their own sake, of sharing emotional content without strategic objectives, was completely outside their cultural framework. But as he listened to the stories being broadcast from Terra Nova, something unexpected happened in his consciousness. The trivial details began to create a composite image that transcended the simple biological data in his tactical files. Emma Chen was no longer just human juvenile, 7 standard years, minimal threat assessment. She became a unique individual whose existence had mattered to others in ways that couldn't be quantified or measured. The realization struck him with disturbing force. He had been responsible for ending a unique consciousness that could never be replicated or replaced. The mathematical precision of Zephyrian military doctrine suddenly seemed inadequate to address the magnitude of what had been lost. Commander, incoming priority transmission from High Command, Nixtal announced, her voice grateful for the interruption of their increasingly uncomfortable observation duty. Admiral Zefkar's image materialized on the bridge's communication display, his ancient carapace bearing the ceremonial markings that indicated his position among the Empire's highest military leadership. his compound eyes fixed on Kethvar with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated subordinates for over 2 centuries. Commander, your mission report indicates successful neutralization of human technological threat with minimal collateral damage. However, intelligence networks have detected unusual human communication patterns originating from your target location. Explain. Kethvar felt his mandibles click involuntarily, a nervous gesture he hadn't displayed since his early military training. The humans have initiated memorial protocols for the single casualty resulting from our operation. Their grief response exceeds predicted parameters. Memorial protocols? Admiral Zefkar's voice carried harmonic frequencies that indicated skepticism. For a single individual? This behavior pattern was not included in your tactical assessment. No, sir. Human emotional responses appear to operate according to principles not covered in existing psychological models. The individual casualty has become a focal point for colony-wide behavioral changes that persist beyond expected grief duration parameters. Admiral Zefkar's compound eyes shifted in patterns that suggested careful consideration. The Zephyrian military hierarchy operated on principles of precise information flow and rational decision-making. Unexpected variables in post-operation analysis were considered serious concerns requiring detailed investigation. Commander, you will continue monitoring human responses until their behavioral patterns return to normal operational status. High Command requires complete understanding of human psychological recovery protocols before authorizing additional interventions. The communication link terminated, leaving Kethvar alone with orders that felt increasingly impossible to fulfill. Human behavioral patterns showed no signs of returning to normal operational status. If anything, the intensity of their grief responses was increasing with time, spreading to populations far beyond the directly affected community. Sir? Nixtal's voice carried urgent undertones. I'm detecting a significant development in human communication patterns. Kethvar returned his attention to the sensor displays, where new data streams were appearing across multiple frequencies. The humans weren't just broadcasting stories about Emma Chen anymore. They were transmitting detailed accounts of the entire incident, complete with technical analysis of the fusion reactor destruction and theories about possible causes. They're conducting their own investigation, Nixtal reported. Human engineers have been analyzing the reactor destruction patterns and have concluded that the damage was caused by external intervention rather than system failure. A cold sensation of dread began forming in Kethvar's consciousness. The humans were methodically eliminating natural causes for their tragedy, using scientific analysis to narrow the possible explanations. Their investigation techniques were primitive by Zephyrian standards, but their persistence and attention to detail were remarkable. Have they identified the source of the intervention? Kethvar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Not specifically, but they have concluded that the energy beam originated from orbital position. They are beginning to broadcast queries directed at potential unknown observers. The queries were transmitted on multiple frequencies in dozens of languages, including several that Zephyrian linguists had never encountered. The messages were simple but direct. We know someone is watching. We know someone caused this. We don't understand why, but we want to understand. Please talk to us. The humanity of those messages struck Kethvar with unexpected force. There was no threat in their communications, no demand for retaliation or compensation. The humans simply wanted to understand what had happened to their child and why. They were reaching out to unknown observers with the same trust and openness that Emma had shown when freeing a butterfly from a spider's web.
Commander, how should we respond to these queries? Nixtal asked.
Standard protocol was clear. Maintain operational security, deny involvement, continue monitoring until the situation stabilized. But looking at the sensor displays showing Emma's parents still visiting her memorial every day, still placing fresh flowers beside her monument, still broadcasting stories about her brief existence, Kethvar found himself questioning whether standard protocol was adequate for this situation. Sir, Nixtal prompted when he failed to respond. Continue monitoring, Kethvar finally ordered. File daily reports on human behavioral patterns. Make no response to their queries. But even as he gave these orders, Kethvar knew they felt wrong. The humans were asking for understanding, not vengeance. They were seeking communication, not conflict. Their approach to this tragedy was completely unlike anything in Zephyrian experience, and responding with silence and deception seemed like compounding the original error rather than managing its consequences. Days passed into weeks, and the human behavioral patterns continued to evolve in ways that challenged every prediction model in Zephyrian databases. Instead of diminishing, their memorial activities intensified. Instead of accepting Emma's death as inevitable tragedy, they began implementing changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Safety protocols around agricultural areas were enhanced. Emergency response systems were upgraded. Most significantly, they established a scholarship program in Emma's name to support education in xenobiology and interspecies communication based on their growing conviction that her death had resulted from misunderstanding between different forms of intelligence. They believe her death was caused by communication failure, Nixtal reported during one of their daily briefings. They have concluded that unknown observers misinterpreted their activities and responded with excessive force due to lack of proper diplomatic contact. The accuracy of this assessment was disturbing. Without access to Zephyrian intelligence or understanding of empire politics, the humans had analyzed their situation and reached conclusions that were remarkably close to the truth. More troubling, they were responding to these conclusions not with military preparation or defensive measures, but with attempts to establish communication protocols that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. "They're trying to talk to us," Kethvar said, though he spoke more to himself than to his subordinate. "Sir?" "The humans. They're not seeking revenge or preparing for war. They're trying to establish communication with whoever killed their child because they believe it was a misunderstanding." Nixtal's forearms paused their constant motion, a gesture that indicated profound confusion. This behavior pattern contradicts all established models for post-attack responses. Standard protocol requires retaliation or defensive preparation when civilian populations are targeted. But the humans weren't following standard protocol. They were following their own uniquely human approach to tragedy, which seemed to involve attempting to understand rather than simply react. Their broadcasts continued daily, sharing not just stories about Emma, but detailed information about human culture, biology, and social structures, as if they were creating a comprehensive introduction for any unknown observers who might be willing to establish contact. "Commander," Nixtal's voice carried warning tones, "I'm detecting changes in your neural chemistry that exceed safe parameters. Request permission to contact medical services." Kethvar was aware of the changes occurring in his thought processes. The recurring memories of Emma's death had evolved from simple tactical recollection into something that affected his ability to function normally. Sleep cycles had become irregular, appetite had decreased, and concentration required constant conscious effort. But more disturbing than these physical symptoms was the growing weight of something that Zephyrian psychology had no adequate framework to process. Every day he watched Emma's parents tend her memorial. Every night he heard their broadcasts sharing memories of her brief existence, and the responsibility for her death felt heavier rather than lighter with time. "Medical intervention will not be necessary," he stated, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sir, your behavioral patterns suggest the development of what human psychology terms guilt response. This emotional state can lead to compromised decision-making and should be addressed through established therapeutic protocols." The word hung in the air between them like a foreign concept requiring translation. Guilt. Zephyrians had terminology for regret over tactical errors, for disappointment in failed objectives, for concern about future consequences. But guilt, the crushing weight of responsibility for unnecessary harm, was outside their emotional vocabulary. "I am experiencing no psychological dysfunction," Kethvar insisted, though the statement felt hollow even as he spoke it. But privately, he was beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed in his consciousness. The sight of Emma Chen falling from the apple tree had triggered responses in his neural pathways that weren't supposed to exist. The weight of her death was growing rather than diminishing, creating psychological pressure that standard Zephyrian coping mechanisms couldn't address. And with each passing day, as he watched the humans continuing their attempts to communicate with unknown observers, continuing to share stories about their lost child, continuing to approach this tragedy with openness rather than hostility, the weight of that guilt grew heavier. For the first time in his military career, Commander Kethvar was beginning to question whether following orders was enough to justify the consequences of action. And for the first time in Zephyrian history, a military officer was discovering what it meant to wish he could take back something that had already been done. The universe was about to learn that some mistakes create consequences that extend far beyond their original scope, and that guilt, once awakened, has a power that transcends species boundaries. 6 weeks after Emma Chen's death, the psychological pressure that had been building in Commander Kethvar's mind finally found an outlet that would change the trajectory of galactic relations forever. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine mission briefing aboard the Zephyrian command vessel Eternal Dominion, flagship of the Third Battle Fleet. Admiral Zefkar stood before a holographic display showing human colonial expansion across 7 star systems, his ancient carapace reflecting the blue-white light as he outlined new strategic objectives. The meeting included 15 senior commanders, each representing different aspects of the Empire's response to human territorial growth. The discussion was clinical, precise, and thoroughly professional by every standard of Zephyrian military culture. Intelligence reports indicate continued human technological acceleration beyond predicted parameters, Admiral Zefkar stated, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that commanded absolute attention. Colonial populations show remarkable resilience following the Terra Nova intervention, with productivity levels exceeding pre-incident measurements by 12%. Kethvar sat in his designated position among the command circle, but his attention was divided between the Admiral's briefing and the datapad showing daily reports from his continued monitoring of Terra Nova. The human settlement had indeed exceeded pre-incident productivity, but not in ways that Zephyrian analysis had anticipated. Instead of focusing on defensive preparations or military expansion, the humans had channeled their grief into what appeared to be cultural evolution. Emma Chen's death had catalyzed changes in human social structures that rippled across their entire colonial network. Educational programs emphasizing interspecies communication had been established on dozens of worlds. Research initiatives focused on peaceful contact protocols had received funding that exceeded many planets' entire defense budgets. The Terra Nova incident appears to have triggered adaptive responses rather than destabilization, continued Admiral Zefkar. Human psychological resilience exceeds predictions in every measurable category. The words Terra Nova incident struck Kethvar like physical blows. The clinical terminology transformed Emma's death into a statistical data point, reducing the unique individual consciousness to a tactical footnote in military planning documents. The disconnect between the language being used and the reality he had witnessed created cognitive dissonance that was becoming impossible to ignore. Commander Kethvar, Admiral Zefkar's voice drew his attention back to the briefing. Your field reports have been comprehensive. However, High Command requires clarification on human grief response duration. Standard models predict emotional recovery within 6 to 8 weeks for individual casualties. Your reports indicate continued memorial activity beyond established parameters. Kethvar felt his mandibles click involuntarily as 15 pairs of compound eyes focused on his response. The question should have been simple to answer using standard psychological terminology, but the words that formed in his mind seemed inadequate to describe what he had observed. The humans continue daily memorial activities with no indication of emotional recovery, he reported. Their behavioral patterns suggest that individual loss creates permanent psychological changes rather than temporary grief responses. Permanent? Admiral Zefkar's voice carried skepticism that bordered on disbelief. No known species maintains indefinite grief response for single individual casualties. Such behavior would create unsustainable psychological burden on surviving population. But that was exactly what Kethvar had been observing. Emma's parents visited her memorial every day, their dedication unwavering despite the passage of time. Other humans continued bringing flowers and sharing stories about her brief existence. Most remarkably, children who had never met Emma began visiting the memorial, having learned about her through the stories being broadcast across human communication networks. The human concept of individual value appears to operate according to principles not covered in existing psychological models, Kethvar explained, though he was aware that his words carried undertones of uncertainty that were unusual for military reporting. Elaborate, Admiral Zefkar commanded. Kethvar hesitated, struggling to find terminology that could adequately convey observations that challenged fundamental assumptions about rational behavior. They appear to assign infinite value to individual consciousness, regardless of practical contribution to society. The deceased juvenile's impact on their cultural development exceeds her biological or economic significance by unmeasurable margins. The briefing room fell into silence that stretched beyond comfortable parameters. Among Zephyrians, individual value was calculated according to precise formulas that considered genetic contribution, skill development, and social productivity. The concept of assigning infinite value to any single consciousness was not just foreign but potentially destabilizing to social order. Such assessment methodology would create unsustainable social dynamics, observed Commander Thalvin, whose expertise in xenopsychology made him the fleet's primary authority on alien behavioral patterns. No civilization could maintain cohesion while assigning equal infinite value to all individual consciousness. But humans were doing exactly that, and their civilization was not only maintaining cohesion, but was showing signs of accelerated development in areas that Zephyrian analysts found difficult to quantify. Artistic expression had increased dramatically across human colonies. Scientific collaboration between settlements had reached unprecedented levels. Most puzzling, their military capabilities were actually decreasing as resources were redirected toward communication technologies and peaceful exploration initiatives. Their response to individual loss is creating civilization-wide changes that exceed strategic threat models. Kethvar continued, though speaking these observations aloud was creating responses in his neural pathways that he was struggling to process.
They are evolving rapidly, but not in directions that our tactical planning anticipated.
Admiral Zefkar studied the holographic displays with the calculating gaze that had guided Zephyrian strategy for decades. The data clearly showed human development accelerating beyond predicted parameters, that the acceleration was occurring in areas that traditional military analysis struggled to categorize as either threats or opportunities. Command assessment. Human psychological responses represent unknown variables that require additional study. Admiral Zefkar declared. Authorization granted for expanded monitoring operations across all human colonial territories. Priority objective: determine whether human grief responses represent exploitable weakness or unrecognized strategic advantage. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistical details and operational parameters for the expanded monitoring program. But Kethvar found his attention fragmenting as the clinical discussion progressed. The other commanders spoke about human behavioral patterns as if they were discussing weather phenomena or geological formations, treating conscious beings as subjects for study, rather than individuals capable of suffering. When the briefing concluded, Kethvar returned to his quarters with a feeling of disconnection that was becoming increasingly familiar. The Spartan accommodations reflected Zephyrian efficiency principles: sleeping alcove calibrated for optimal rest cycles, workstation equipped with communication and analysis interfaces, environmental controls adjusted for peak performance parameters, but the space felt empty in ways that had nothing to do with physical arrangement. For the first time in his military career, Kethvar was experiencing loneliness, another concept for which Zephyrian psychology had no adequate framework. His personal communication display showed 17 unread messages from various military departments requesting additional data about human behavioral patterns. Each message treated the Terra Nova incident as a valuable intelligence opportunity, analyzing human responses for strategic advantages or tactical vulnerabilities. None of the messages mentioned Emma Chen by name. None acknowledged that a unique individual consciousness had been lost. None showed any awareness that their intelligence operations were built on the foundation of a child's unnecessary death. The weight of isolation that settled over Kethvar's consciousness was unlike anything in his previous experience. Among Zephyrians, emotional responses were shared through harmonic communication that created collective understanding and mutual support. But the emotions he was experiencing had no equivalent in Zephyrian psychology, leaving him fundamentally alone with feelings that his own species couldn't comprehend. That night, Kethvar made a decision that would have been impossible to imagine 6 weeks earlier. He accessed the ship's communication array and tuned into the human broadcast from Terra Nova, listening to the daily stories about Emma Chen that her community continued to share across the galaxy. The stories had evolved over the weeks, moving beyond simple memories to become something that approached mythology. Humans from across their colonial network had begun contributing their own stories inspired by Emma's brief existence. Children created art depicting her adventures in imaginary landscapes. Adults wrote music that captured the joy she had brought to her community. Scientists dedicated research projects to her memory, working to understand the natural world she had loved so deeply. What struck Kethvar most profoundly was the absence of anger in these transmissions. The humans mourning Emma Chen had never called for vengeance against her killers. They had never demanded justice or retribution. Instead, they had transformed their grief into something that celebrated her existence while working to prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. Emma would have wanted us to make friends with the stars, her mother had said in one transmission. She always believed that everyone was good inside, even when they made mistakes. Maybe whoever caused this was just scared and didn't understand. Maybe they need friends too. The simple faith in those words created responses in Kethvar's neural pathways that he had never experienced before. Emma's mother was extending forgiveness to beings she had never seen, offering friendship to the unknown observers who had killed her daughter. The generosity of spirit required for such a response exceeded anything in Zephyrian cultural experience. Over the following days, Kethvar found himself returning to the human broadcasts with increasing frequency. The stories about Emma created a composite picture of childhood innocence that transcended species boundaries. Her joy in discovering butterfly wings, her careful attention to flower arrangements, her belief that even spiders deserve gentle treatment. These details accumulated into an understanding of individual consciousness that Zephyrian education had never addressed. But it was the ongoing human attempts to establish communication with unknown observers that finally pushed Kethvar beyond the bounds of military protocol. The humans had created a comprehensive introduction to their species, broadcasting detailed information about their culture, history, and values, in the hope that any watching civilizations might respond with similar openness. Their transmissions included mathematical principles that demonstrated scientific knowledge, artistic expressions that revealed aesthetic sensibilities, and philosophical discussions that showed their approach to ethical questions. But most compelling were the personal messages from individuals across human space, sharing their hopes for peaceful contact with other forms of consciousness. Children recorded messages expressing excitement about meeting aliens. Adults shared their dreams of learning about other civilizations. Scientists discussed the potential for collaborative research across species boundaries. The overwhelming theme was curiosity and welcome rather than fear or suspicion. "We know someone is out there," Emma's father had said in one particularly moving transmission. "We know you're watching, and we want you to know that we're not angry. We don't understand what happened, but we believe in the possibility of understanding." Emma taught us that everyone deserves a chance to explain. Everyone deserves forgiveness. Everyone deserves friendship. We're waiting for you to talk to us when you're ready. The weight of those words created a psychological crisis in Kethvar's consciousness that standard Zephyrian coping mechanisms couldn't address. For weeks he had been carrying the knowledge that these trusting, open beings were broadcasting messages of friendship to the very individuals who had killed their child. They were offering forgiveness to beings who hadn't asked for it, extending welcome to observers who remained hidden in the shadows. The disconnect between human trust and Zephyrian deception became impossible to sustain. Kethvar found himself unable to sleep, unable to concentrate, unable to maintain the emotional equilibrium that effective military service required. The guilt that had been growing in his consciousness was now affecting his ability to function within normal parameters. It was Sub-Commander Nixtal who finally forced the issue to crisis point. She approached him during a routine duty shift with concerns that could no longer be ignored within military protocol. "Commander, your psychological state is creating operational concerns," she reported, her four arms moving across control interfaces with the mechanical precision that characterized Zephyrian efficiency. "Sleep disruption has exceeded safe parameters. Concentration during tactical exercises shows measurable degradation. Request permission to initiate medical intervention protocols." Kethvar looked at his subordinate with the realization that his personal crisis was beginning to affect others under his command. Nixtal's concern was legitimate according to every standard of military professionalism. His declining performance was creating security risks that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. "Medical intervention will not address the core issue," he stated. Though speaking this admission aloud felt like crossing a line from which there could be no return. "Sir? The psychological pressure I am experiencing results from knowledge that conflicts with continuing operational requirements. Medical treatment cannot resolve ethical contradictions." Nixtal's forearms ceased their motion entirely, a gesture that indicated profound confusion. Ethics was not a concept that typically interfered with military operations in Zephyrian culture. Duty, efficiency, and obedience to command authority provided clear frameworks for decision-making that eliminated most potential conflicts. "Commander, please clarify the nature of these ethical contradictions." Kethvar stood at a crossroads that would define not only his own future, but potentially the relationship between their entire species and humanity. He could continue following orders, maintain operational security, and file reports that treated human consciousness as subjects for tactical analysis. Or he could acknowledge that Emma Chen's death had created obligations that transcended military protocol. "Sub-Commander," he said slowly, "what would be the appropriate response if our operations had caused unintended harm to innocent beings who continue to offer friendship despite our actions?" The question hung in the air between them like a foreign concept requiring translation. In Zephyrian military doctrine, unintended harm was classified as acceptable collateral damage within calculated margins of error. The concept of owing responses to affected beings was not covered in established protocols. "Sir, I do not understand the question." But Kethvar was beginning to understand that the question was becoming the most important thing in his existence. The humans were offering forgiveness and friendship to the unknown beings who had killed their child. They were waiting for communication from observers who remained hidden behind tactical protocols and operational security. And for the first time in Zephyrian military history, an officer was discovering that some obligations transcended the chain of command. The moment that would reshape galactic history began with a simple technical malfunction aboard the monitoring station, Void's Edge. 3 months after Emma Chen's death, a routine maintenance procedure on the ship's communication array created a brief but detectable energy signature that human sensors on Terra Nova managed to identify and trace to its orbital source. Commander Kefar watched the detection unfold through his sensor displays with a mixture of dread and something that might have been relief. For weeks, he had been struggling with the weight of deception while listening to human broadcasts pleading for communication with their unknown observers. The accidental exposure felt like the universe forcing a decision he had been unable to make himself. "Commander, the humans have acquired a lock on our position," Sub-Commander Nick Stahl reported, her forearms dancing across control interfaces with increased urgency. Their scanning attempts show primitive but persistent methodology. Stealth systems are maintaining operational security, but continued observation will eventually compromise our position. The rational response was immediate withdrawal from Terra Nova's orbital space, followed by deployment of sensor drones that could maintain surveillance from safer distances. Standard protocol called for avoiding direct contact with pre-contact civilizations under all circumstances, maintaining operational security at any cost to preserve strategic advantages. But as Kefvar studied the human scanning patterns, he realized their efforts were neither aggressive nor threatening. Instead of attempting to disable or destroy the unknown vessel they had detected, the humans were simply trying to establish communication. Their scanning beams carried modulated signals that contained mathematical sequences, prime numbers, and basic scientific constants, universal concepts that any spacefaring civilization would recognize as attempts at peaceful contact. "They're not trying to attack us," Kefvar observed, though speaking this realization aloud felt like acknowledging something that his military training had never prepared him to address. "Sir, threat assessment remains inconclusive," Nixtal responded. "Human technological capabilities are primitive, but their detection of our stealth systems suggests adaptation rates that exceed standard projection models. Through the ship's sensors, they could observe increased activity at the Terra Nova settlement. Humans were gathering around their communication equipment with expressions of excitement and anticipation rather than fear or aggression. Their body language displayed patterns that Zephyrian anthropologists had categorized as hope and curiosity rather than hostility. "Sir, orders from High Command are explicit regarding contact protocols," Nixtal continued. "Immediate withdrawal and maintenance of operational security are required when stealth capabilities are compromised." Kefvar knew the orders, had followed them throughout his military career without question or hesitation. But watching the humans on Terra Nova preparing their communication attempts with such obvious hope and trust, he found himself unable to give the commands that would take them away from this moment. 3 months of listening to human broadcasts had created fundamental changes in his consciousness that Zephyrian psychology had no framework to address. The daily stories about Emma Chen, the ongoing attempts to establish peaceful contact, the constant expressions of forgiveness for unknown beings who had killed their child, these experiences had accumulated into something that transcended military protocol. "Sub-Commander," Kefvar said slowly, "what is the probability that immediate withdrawal will end human attempts to establish contact?" Nixtal's arms paused their motion across the control interfaces, indicating surprise at the question. Tactical assessments typically focused on mission objectives and operational security, rather than the long-term consequences of actions on observed civilizations. Human persistence patterns suggest continued attempts at contact regardless of immediate response, she reported after consulting behavioral analysis databases. Their communication efforts have increased in frequency and sophistication over the past weeks. Withdrawal will likely result in expanded search operations across multiple star systems. The accuracy of this assessment was clear from the human broadcasts Kefvar had been monitoring. Emma's death had triggered a fundamental shift in human priorities, redirecting resources from expansion and development toward communication and peaceful contact initiatives. They were actively searching for the observers they believed had caused their tragedy, driven by a desire for understanding rather than vengeance. "Sir, additional considerations," Nixtal continued. "Human technological adaptation rates suggest they will eventually develop capabilities to detect Zephyrian stealth systems regardless of our current tactical advantages. Contact protocols may become unavoidable within standard operational timeframes." This was the strategic reality that High Command was struggling to address. Human development rates exceeded all prediction models, driven by psychological patterns that Zephyrian analysts found impossible to quantify. Their approach to technological advancement was chaotic and intuitive rather than systematic, but it was producing results that challenged established assumptions about civilizational development.
Commander, incoming transmission from Terra Nova, Nixtol announced.
Human communication attempt on multiple frequencies, mathematical sequences followed by what appears to be linguistic content. HFY moved to the communication station and activated the translation protocols that would convert human language into Zephyrian understanding. The voice that emerged from the speakers was familiar from months of monitoring. Emma's father, speaking with the same gentle confidence that had characterized his daughter's approach to the natural world. "Hello, friends among the stars," the human said, his words carrying across the void with simple dignity. "We know you're listening. We've known for months that someone has been watching our world, and we believe you were involved in what happened to our daughter. We're not angry. We want to understand. Emma would have wanted us to make friends even with beings who made mistakes. Please talk to us." The directness of the appeal struck HFY with force that exceeded physical impact. There was no deception in the human's words, no hidden agenda or tactical maneuvering. Just a father who had lost his child, asking for communication from the beings responsible for her death, offering friendship instead of demanding justice. "Sir, response protocols?" Nixtol asked, though her voice carried undertones of uncertainty that suggested she was also affected by the human's simple request. "Sub-Commander," HFY said quietly, "activate communication protocols." "Sir." Nixtal's forearms froze in positions that indicated profound confusion. Response authorization is not covered in current operational parameters. High Command approval is required for first contact scenarios. "I am authorizing direct response under emergency protocols," HFY stated, though he was aware that his authority didn't actually extend to such decisions. The tactical situation has evolved beyond standard operational parameters. This was true, though not in ways that military doctrine anticipated. The tactical situation had evolved because a Zephyrian commander had developed emotional responses that his species had no framework to process or understand. The emergency was psychological rather than strategic, personal rather than political. "Sir, please confirm authorization codes for first contact protocols." HFY looked at his subordinate, understanding that he was asking her to violate direct orders from High Command based on his personal psychological crisis. In Zephyrian military culture, such requests were unprecedented and potentially career-ending for both officers involved. But the alternative was returning to base, with the weight of Emma Chen's death still unacknowledged, the human offers of friendship still unanswered, the guilt still growing in his consciousness without resolution. The tactical calculations that had guided his entire military career suddenly seemed inadequate to address the reality of individual consciousness and moral responsibility. "Sub-Commander," he said slowly, "what is your assessment of human intentions based on 3 months of behavioral observation?" Nixtal's arms moved across data interfaces, consulting the extensive files they had compiled on human psychological patterns. Human communications show no indication of hostile intent. Their technology development has focused on peaceful applications. Their response to the Terra Nova incident has emphasized communication and understanding rather than retaliation or defensive preparation. "And what is your assessment of continued deception regarding our involvement in their tragedy?" This question pushed beyond standard military analysis into territory that Zephyrian training had never addressed. Nixtal struggled with concepts that had no equivalent in their cultural framework, attempting to process ethical considerations that weren't covered in operational protocols. "Sir, human psychological patterns suggest that continued uncertainty regarding their loss is creating ongoing distress that affects their entire civilization. Their attempts to establish communication have become increasingly desperate as time progresses without response." The accuracy of this assessment was clear from the human broadcasts they had been monitoring. Emma's community was struggling not just with grief but with the absence of understanding about her death. They had created theories and explanations, but the lack of concrete knowledge was creating psychological pressure that rippled across their entire colonial network. "Sub-Commander, I am ordering direct communication with Terra Nova settlement. Emergency protocols justify deviation from standard first contact procedures." Nixtal's forearms trembled as they hovered over the communication controls. In her centuries of military service, she had never been asked to make decisions that contradicted direct orders from High Command. But she had also never encountered situations that standard orders seemed inadequate to address. Sir, if we proceed with unauthorized contact, both our careers will be terminated. Possible charges include insubordination, violation of first contact protocols, and compromise of strategic security. Kethvar understood the risks, had calculated them repeatedly over the past weeks as his psychological crisis intensified. But the alternative, continuing to carry the weight of Emma Chen's unacknowledged death while listening to her parents offer friendship to her killers, had become impossible to sustain. Sub-Commander, some obligations transcend career considerations. The words hung in the air between them like foreign concepts requiring translation. In Zephyrian culture, military career represented the ultimate expression of individual purpose and social contribution. The concept of sacrificing career advancement for abstract ethical principles was outside their normal framework of understanding. But something in Kethvar's voice, some harmonic frequency that Nixtal had never heard before, communicated the depth of conviction behind his words. She looked at her commander, this being who had spent centuries following orders without question, and saw something that challenged every assumption about Zephyrian military psychology. Sir, she said slowly, if we proceed with unauthorized contact, what message do you intend to transmit? Kethvar moved to the communication interface and began composing words that would either bridge the gap between species or destroy his military career. Probably both. But the weight of 3 months' guilt and the sound of human voices offering friendship to their child's killers had created obligations that transcended tactical considerations. We respond with truth, he said simply. They deserve to know what happened to their daughter. The transmission that would reshape galactic history began with a simple phrase that carried the weight of 3 months of accumulated guilt and the power to bridge an impossible gap between species. Commander Kethvar's voice, translated through advanced linguistic protocols, reached the surface of Terra Nova carrying words that no Zephyrian had ever spoken to an unknown civilization. People of Terra Nova, he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. This is Commander Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire. We have been watching your world for several months. I am responsible for the death of your child, Emma Chen, and I have come to ask for your forgiveness. The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch across the void between worlds, carrying implications that extended far beyond personal confession. In the Terra Nova Communication Center, human operators stared at their equipment with expressions of shock, hope, and desperate attention. This was the moment they had been working toward for months, the contact they had been seeking despite having no guarantee that anyone was listening to their broadcasts. Emma's father, who had been manning the communication station when the transmission arrived, leaned forward with hands that trembled as they adjusted the reception controls. His voice, when he finally responded, carried the same gentle strength that had characterized his daughter's approach to the world. Commander Kethvar, he said slowly, thank you for talking to us. We've been hoping someone would answer. Can you tell us what happened? We need to understand. The directness of the human response struck Kethvar with unexpected force. Where Zephyrian culture would have demanded elaborate protocols for such momentous first contact, the humans simply wanted to understand what had happened to their child. Their priorities were personal and immediate, rather than political or strategic. 3 months ago, my ship detected energy signatures from your colony that suggested advanced fusion technology, Kethvar continued, each word carrying the weight of accumulated guilt and growing understanding. Our orders were to investigate and neutralize potential technological threats. I fired on your fusion reactor with a precision beam designed to destroy the technology without harming your population. He paused, struggling with words that had no equivalent in military reporting protocols. How could tactical language adequately describe the moment when carefully calculated precision had become devastating tragedy? The explosion created ground tremors that we had not anticipated in our calculations. Your daughter was climbing a tree near the impact site. The tree fell, and she was killed. This was not our intention, but it was our responsibility. I've been carrying this knowledge for 3 months, listening to your broadcasts, hearing you offer friendship to the beings who killed your child. Through the ship's sensors, Kethvar could observe the human reaction to his confession unfolding in real time. Emma's father sat in stunned silence, processing information that answered questions his community had been struggling with for months. Other humans gathered around the communication station, their faces displaying mixtures of grief, shock, and something that might have been relief at finally having answers to questions that had been consuming their collective consciousness.
You killed Emma because you thought our fusion reactor was dangerous? Emma's father asked, his voice carrying confusion rather than anger.
But why didn't you just ask us about it? Why didn't you try to communicate first? The simplicity of the question revealed the fundamental disconnect between Zephyrian and human approaches to conflict resolution. In Zephyrian military doctrine, potential threats were neutralized through decisive action based on calculated assessment. The concept of requesting clarification from potential enemies was considered strategically unsound and operationally dangerous. But the humans had no framework for understanding preemptive strikes against perceived threats. Their response to unknown dangers was to seek communication and understanding rather than preparing for conflict. The question revealed assumptions about universal behavior that Zephyrian culture had never considered. In our experience, civilizations with advanced technology represent potential threats to galactic stability. Kethvar explained, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. Our protocols require neutralizing such threats before they can develop into military capabilities that might challenge established order. But we're not a threat, Emma's father responded with bewilderment that carried clearly across the communication link. We're farmers, and researchers and teachers. Our fusion reactor powers irrigation systems and greenhouses. We've never even considered using our technology for weapons. The gulf between Zephyrian assumptions and human reality was becoming clear through their exchange. The Empire had classified human technological advancement as threatening because it exceeded predicted development rates, but they had never considered that acceleration might be directed toward purely peaceful applications. Your technological development rates exceed all models in our databases. Kethvar continued, trying to explain decisions that were feeling increasingly indefensible as he spoke them aloud. Species that advance so rapidly typically develop military capabilities that destabilize established galactic order. But why would we want to destabilize anything? Emma's mother had joined the conversation, her voice carrying the same gentle strength that had characterized her daily broadcasts about her daughter. We're just trying to build homes and raise children and understand the universe. We never wanted to hurt anyone. The innocence in her words created responses in Kethvar's consciousness that transcended linguistic translation. This was the mother whose child he had killed, speaking to him not with hatred or demands for justice, but with genuine confusion about why anyone would consider her people threatening. The generosity of spirit required for such a response exceeded anything in Zephyrian cultural experience. Commander, Emma's father continued, we need to ask you something important. When Emma died, we didn't know what had happened. We've been in pain for months, not understanding, not knowing if there was something we could have done differently. Can you help us understand exactly what happened so we can have some peace? The request for detailed information about their child's death would have been impossible for most species to make to the beings responsible for that death. But the humans were seeking closure and understanding rather than revenge or compensation. They wanted to process their grief completely rather than carrying uncertainty indefinitely. Kethvar found himself providing details that military protocols would never have permitted sharing with unknown civilizations. He described the energy readings that had triggered their intervention, the precision calculations that had gone into the reactor strike, the unforeseeable variables that had created ground tremors exceeding predicted parameters. More importantly, he shared what he had observed through their senses during Emma's final moments. Her joy as she climbed toward the apples, her satisfaction at reaching the branch, her awareness of danger as the tree began to fall. He spoke of her gentleness with the butterfly she had freed from the spider's web, her careful selection of wildflowers for her mother, her laughter echoing across the wheat fields in those final moments of innocence. She wasn't afraid, he concluded, though speaking these words required effort that exceeded physical exertion. The final sensor readings showed no indicators of fear or suffering. She was focused on reaching the fruit, concentrated on the immediate task. The end came quickly. The silence that followed his description lasted several minutes, filled with the weight of grief finally given concrete details to process. When Emma's mother finally spoke, her voice carried tears but also something that might have been gratitude. Thank you for telling us, she said simply. We needed to know. We've been imagining so many possibilities and not knowing was making everything harder. At least now we can understand what happened. The grace of her response created psychological pressure in Kethvar's consciousness that threatened to overwhelm his ability to maintain coherent communication. This being whose child he had killed was thanking him for providing information about her daughter's death. The forgiveness implicit in her words transcended every framework for understanding justice or mercy that Zephyrian culture possessed. There is something else, Kethvar continued. Driven by psychological pressure, that was.